Hey, this is a video where I'm going to try and philosophically characterize the broadest yet truly underpinning difference, I think, between Eastern and Western religions. And here I'm going to zero in on Hinduism and Buddhism in the East and the Abrahamic tradition in the West. And now I know Hinduism and Buddhism do have more typically religious aspects where you have, gods and beliefs in supernatural beings and cosmic arrangements that go beyond what we can see. But this is tending to arrive later, especially in the case of Buddhism. I'm not clear on Hinduism because Hinduism actually is a collection of schools that used to be independent of each other, were loosely associated by the Vedas, which are kind of like the closest thing Hinduism has to a Bible. So these aspects are not as central to these faiths because a lot of the early stuff was just purely philosophy. So like Hindu schools would say posit a self, and Buddhists would come back with the idea of no self. But what they're really in the business of is their core enterprise was talking about what we can know. Like, so for example, they'll talk about reality and what we could possibly know about it based on what we can see, interpret, and they'll disagree on methods of coming to knowledge. I mean, they all basically would agree on the senses, but some would take, say, testimony of the Vedas. But the point is, these early Buddhist and Hindu philosophical schools, they started from the outside in. So they looked at the world around them, tried to draw conclusions on it, and then they tried to interpret it, interpret the world in light of those conclusions. So, for example, something like karma is really an outside-in kind of idea. I mean, you look around you and all you see is things being born and things dying, things being born and things dying. The trees die, come back, animals die, come back, people die, and more are born. It's kind of if you're thinking about the tool set, the mental, rational tool set they had to come to conclusions, and you're just looking around and trying to draw conclusions based on what you see. A doctrine of reincarnation and karma, really, like, reincarnation is the point here, but I mean, like, karma is attached, because reincarnation is a belief that goes across the Buddhist Hindu divide, and within the various Hindu divides, it really is central to the philosophy of, we're really talking about like India here, where these ideas obviously began, and in the case of Buddhism were exported and really changed radically in Asia. Hinduism is mainly confined to India. But anyway, the point is, when you think about reincarnation in that way, it really is an outside in. You see these cycles on Earth and you say, okay, there must be a cycle, and we must, or at least it makes sense to say that we're going to be reborn at some time. I mean, what are the odds that this would just be my one time here? I mean, if there's all this cycling, the odds are I've been here at some time in the past and I'm going to be here again in the future. Now, that's not necessarily a conclusion that everyone at the time would have drawn, but it seems to be drawn in a generally orthodox way, and it's not completely irrational based on the circumstances on the ground. So really, in these faiths, philosophically, we see really a commitment to examining the world and trying to draw conclusions. I mean, life is suffering. That's totally, the central claim of Buddhism, life is suffering. That is totally a outside-in principle. I mean, you look around and you see, oh wow, this is the condition, and you draw that conclusion, as the Buddha did when he left the palace. So we're talking outside in. Now we're going to the Abrahamic traditions, where it's philosophically and pretty much on every level, it's the opposite. In these faiths, we're having a narrative that is projected onto the world. So we're starting inside. We're starting with the idea, and we're going to go and we're going to force that idea to conform with reality, and we're going to argue and bend when we need to in order to thrust our narrative on reality. And that's really what it is from the beginning of the Old Testament, it's God created the world, and it's the ideas of God that are being projected upon the outside. So the inside of God's mind is, in essence, what this reality that this desk I'm knocking on is the inside of God's mind. So really, it's an inside out way of projecting on the world. And this is, actually requires less explanation than the Eastern side, because it really is simple. You have a narrative and you thrust it on reality, and you either ignore or bend logic or do whatever you have to do to make reality, the outside, conform to the inside, which is your narrative. Whereas in the East, especially in the early Indian Buddhist philosophy and the various schools of Hinduism that both succeeded and preceded that, and argued with that, as all those traditions that were relevant at various times, debated amongst each other and developed their ideas further. That is totally a looking outside and drawing conclusions enterprise, whereas the Abrahamic enterprise, which just totally dominates the West, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, is totally a inside thrust upon the outside arrangement philosophically, where we have the narrative and we're imposing that on reality. And that, I think, is broadly philosophically the fundamental difference between Eastern and Western religions, or at least the ones I've talked about. Hey, just to add something, I did mention that the Eastern religions, Hinduism and Buddhism I talked about, have religious aspects, but there's much more of a division between those, religious aspects, which tend to take on a very local character, God, spirits, whatever, superstition, and the philosophical aspects of those religions, which tend to be schools that exist for intellectuals, and the local people would not be in on, or the people who aren't involved in these debates, which would be the majority of people at the time, wouldn't have been there, or wouldn't have known about it. And there's much more of a division there, whereas in the Abrahamic tradition, there really is no separating the philosophical from the religious in any credible way. They're found in the same book. They're tied up, whereas in the traditions I mentioned in the East, there's really a division between very local, spiritual kind of more religious aspects, and just like philosophical bubbles that kind of had a life of their own.